What if the Choctaw were never one single people, but the result of many histories becoming one? And what if the DNA does not destroy their story, but reveals how extraordinary it really is? If you like stories that flip the textbook on its head, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with one person who still thinks history is simple. For most people, the Choctaw story begins with a map, not a memory. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. Then, in one brutal sentence, the Trail of Tears. That is how schoolbooks often compress a nation into a line, but the real Choctaw story is not a line. It is a long braid of towns, families, alliances, losses, and returns. It is a story shaped by rivers, by forests, by trade routes, by survival in a landscape that was never empty and never still. Long before federal removals and long before modern DNA testing, the Choctaw were already part of a living world in the Southeast. They were farmers, hunters, diplomats, and builders of community. They were also witnesses to one of the most crowded and complicated regions in North America, and that is where the DNA begins to matter, because genetics does not just ask where people lived. It asks how they became who they are. That question sounds simple, but in genetics, simple answers are rare. A DNA sample does not arrive with a label that says tribe, nation, or culture. It carries patterns, inherited fragments, and clues about movement across generations. When researchers study Native American populations, they often look at three different windows. Mitochondrial DNA follows the maternal line. The Y-chromosome follows the paternal line. Autosomal DNA shows the broader mixture from many ancestors. When those three windows point in the same direction, the story is easier to tell. When they do not, the story becomes more interesting. In the Choctaw case, scientists saw exactly that kind of complexity. Not chaos, not confusion, complexity. And that difference matters because complexity can be read. It can reveal when a group stayed together, when it welcomed new people, and when history forced communities to merge. In several studies of living descendants and nearby ancient remains, researchers found that the Choctaw do carry the broad maternal lineages common across the Americas. That part fits what we already know about the first peopling of the continent, but the surprising part came from the details inside those lineages. Some branches were not just present, they were more frequent than expected, and they sat in a larger pattern that looked older than a single migration event. In plain English, the DNA did not behave like a clean family tree. It behaved like a family reunion that had been happening for a very long time. There were signs of deep local continuity, but there were also signs that different ancestral groups had entered the community at different times. That matters because it tells us the Choctaw were not formed by one arrival and then frozen in place. They were shaped again and again by contact, adaptation, and choice. To understand why that matters, you have to picture the Southeast before the modern borders existed. This was not a quiet edge of the continent. It was a dense world of towns linked by trade, ceremony, marriage, and war. Rivers acted like highways. Shell, stone, food, and stories moved along them. Peoples did not live in sealed boxes. They met, split, joined, and met again. The Choctaw emerged from that world. Their ancestors were tied to the larger Mississippian cultural sphere, a network of societies known for mound building, agriculture, and regional influence. But even that phrase, Choctaw ancestors, is too neat. What we call one nation today grew from many local communities over time. Some groups stayed close to old homelands. Some absorbed neighbors. Some were pushed by drought, conflict, or the collapse of older political centers. The DNA is not rewriting that history. It is confirming that history was never simple in the first place. The paternal line told a similar but not identical story. That is important because male and female lines do not always move together. In many societies, men join a group through warfare, alliance, adoption, or migration, while women carry continuity through family lines and clan membership. When geneticists compare those lines, they can sometimes see the shape of old social rules. In the Choctaw data, the paternal markers did not collapse into one clean pattern that matched only the nearest neighbors. Some lineages were shared across the region, which is expected. But other patterns suggested that the community had experienced episodes of male movement that did not happen all at once. That could mean alliances with outsiders. It could mean the incorporation of captives. It could mean clans absorbing men from other groups during times of upheaval. The key point is this. The Choctaw genome looks like a record of a society that kept rebuilding itself without losing its identity. Recent ancient DNA work has made this even clearer. Scientists are no longer limited to the DNA of living people alone. They can study remains from earlier periods and compare them with modern descendants. That comparison is powerful because it can show continuity where the eye sees only change. In the lower Mississippi Valley, ancient remains from communities that lived centuries before modern tribal names were fixed show a genetic landscape that overlaps with later Choctaw ancestry, but not perfectly. Some ancestry components continue forward, others appear, fade, and return in different proportions. This tells us that identity in the Southeast was not built like a stone wall. It was built like a river delta, New sediment arrived. Old channels shifted. Different streams met and separated. Over time, the shape remained recognizable, but the materials inside it changed. That is not weakness. That is a living system. For people who grew up thinking DNA should give a single answer, this can feel unsettling. We like origin stories that start at one point, move in one direction, and end in one name, but human history rarely works that way. The Choctaw case is uncomfortable only if we assume that being real means being pure. That assumption is the problem. No community with a long history stays untouched. Trade changes people, marriage changes people, war changes people, loss changes people. The Choctaw did not survive by resisting history like a stone resists water. They survived by absorbing pressure, choosing alliances, and turning outside contact into shared belonging. That is why the DNA results do not weaken the Choctaw story. They make it more believable. A people who have endured centuries of upheaval should not look genetically simple. They should look like survivors. Researchers have offered several ways to explain that pattern. One possibility is deep local continuity. In that view, an early founding population settled in the southeast very long ago, stayed connected to the land, and slowly developed its own genetic profile, while still exchanging people with neighbors. Another possibility is repeated, merging between related communities over centuries, especially in a region where towns rose, fell, and moved. A third possibility is that the Choctaw ancestry reflects not one migration, but several smaller ones, each arriving from nearby routes and each leaving a different mark. What matters is that none of these explanations points to a single frozen beginning. Every path leads to mixture over time. That is what the DNA keeps saying, even when people want it to say something cleaner. The Choctaw had social systems that make this kind of mixing easier to understand. The Southeast was full of nations that did not think in terms of strict blood purity. Many communities had clans, adoption rules, marriage ties, and diplomatic relationships that allowed outsiders to become insiders. A stranger could arrive as a prisoner, a refugee, a spouse, or an ally, and over time become part of the social body. That does not make the group less real. It makes it stronger. It means identity was not just inherited, it was negotiated. It was protected through relationship. When a nation survives by gathering people into a common future, the DNA will carry that history. You can see it in the biological record because it first happened in the social one. Then European contact came and changed everything even faster. Disease, war, forced migration, broken trade networks, and the pressure of colonial expansion all scrambled the population landscape of the Southeast. Entire towns vanished. Others regrouped. Some people fled into new alliances. Some were absorbed into larger communities for protection. This is one reason the Choctaw genetic picture looks layered. It is not just ancient history. It also carries the marks of the last 500 years. If you only look for a single origin, you miss the fact that history kept entering the story. Colonization did not simply break nations apart. It also forced new nations to form in order to survive. The Choctaw are one of the clearest examples of that transformation. But the transformation did not erase the old roots. The Choctaw language, community memory, clan systems, and ceremonial life all preserve deep continuity. That matters because DNA can show connection, but it cannot explain meaning. A person can share ancestry with many groups and still belong to one nation through language, obligation, and lived experience. The Choctaw did not become Choctaw because of a lab result. They became Choctaw because generations of people kept recognizing each other, caring for each other, defending a shared way of life. Genetics only tells part of that story, culture tells the rest. And when the two are placed side by side, the picture gets richer, not poorer. The people were not invented by history, they were forged through it. If we go even deeper, the archaeological record adds another layer. The ancestral Southeast was home to mound centers, farming villages, ceremonial gatherings, and large exchange networks long before Europeans arrived. These societies rose, changed, and sometimes collapsed because of climate stress, social conflict, and shifting trade routes. When that happened, people did not disappear. They moved. They joined neighbors. They rebuilt elsewhere. A mound center could fall and still leave descendants. A town could be abandoned and still live on in another community under a different name. DNA is useful here because it can detect continuity even when the material culture changes. Pottery styles shift, political centers relocate, names change. But genetic threads can continue across those breaks, showing that human communities often survive by transforming themselves rather than preserving a single form forever. Quick pause. If your mind is already opening up to this story, press like, subscribe, so you do not miss the next deep dive, and send this to the friend who always asks for the real version. One reason this discussion has become so much more serious in recent years is the improvement in genetic tools. Early studies could only see broad markers. Newer methods can compare tiny shared segments across genomes, estimate when lineages split, and separate older continuity from newer mixing. But these tools come with a warning. DNA never speaks alone. It has to be interpreted alongside archaeology, oral history, language, and tribal knowledge. If you ignore any one of those, you can easily tell the wrong story. The Choctaw case is a perfect example. The science does not say, here is the entire origin of a nation. It says, here is the pattern that shows a nation was formed over time, through repeated contact, and through the persistence of people who refuse to disappear. That last part is important because too many people treat DNA like a courtroom verdict. They want a yes or no answer. They want a single ancestor, a single migration, a single date. But living nations are not crime scenes. They are communities with memory. Oral histories often preserve truths that genetics cannot translate into numbers. A story about coming together after hardship may not give you a chromosome map, but it can still describe the same social event the DNA later reflects. In that sense, science does not replace tradition. It can sometimes confirm the scale of what tradition already knew. For the Choctaw, that means the oldest lesson may be the simplest one. Belonging was made, not found. People became part of the nation because the nation had ways to receive them, test them, teach them, and hold them. If you look at Choctaw history through that lens, the famous moments make more sense. The nation did not survive because it stayed untouched. It survived because it adapted under pressure. It negotiated with French, British, Spanish, and American powers. It built alliances when it had to. It defended territory when it could. It endured removal, land loss, and massive disruption, yet remained a nation with a living language and government. That kind of endurance is not accidental. It is cultural intelligence. It is the ability to recognize danger, absorb change, and still keep a core intact. DNA can record the mixing, but it cannot measure the wisdom that managed the mixing. The Choctaw story is therefore not just about ancestry. It is about strategy, memory, and the discipline of survival. Even the timing matters. Genetic shifts do not happen in a vacuum. They often cluster around periods of stress, migration, or upheaval. That means the Choctaw genome may be carrying the imprint of specific historical pressures, not just ancient deep time. Think about what happens when rivers change course, crops fail, or trade routes collapse. People move, families join new communities. Political borders blur. A nation that is already flexible can absorb those shocks better than one built on rigid ideas of purity. The Choctaw appear to have done exactly that. Their ancestry looks less like a straight road and more like a series of bridges built when the old path disappeared. Every bridge carries evidence of the people who built it, and of the danger that forced them to build. This is where people often get uncomfortable. They hear words like mixture or composite and think those words imply loss. But in human history, mixture is often the opposite of loss. It is how groups widen their options when the world becomes dangerous. It is how they keep children alive when the old system breaks. It is how they turn strangers into relatives and pressure into continuity. In the Choctaw case, the DNA does not show a people who were somehow less real because their history was layered. It shows a people who were real enough to absorb change without shattering. That is a far more impressive achievement than pretending nothing ever changed. Purity is fragile. Survival is adaptive. The Choctaw genome, read honestly, is not the record of an isolated museum piece. It is the record of a living people who kept choosing tomorrow, and that lesson reaches beyond one nation. Genetic studies across the Americas keep revealing the same basic truth. The peoples we label ancient were often assembled through long histories of movement, exchange, and adaptation. That does not make them any less indigenous. It makes the word indigenous more honest. It means rootedness is not the same as sameness. A people can belong to a place because they have lived there, defended it, remembered it, and remade themselves there for generations. The Choctaw help us see that more clearly than ever. They remind us that history is not a clean line from point A to point B. It is a web of crossings, detours, and returns. Once you see that, the whole idea of origin starts to change. Imagine what that means for a young Choctaw person hearing this for the first time. Not that their people came from nowhere, not that they are somehow less authentic because the past was complex, but that their ancestors were clever, flexible, and deeply human. People who built belonging again and again when the world tried to break it. That kind of knowledge can change how you carry your own name. It can turn ancestry from a question of proof into a source of strength. And that is one reason this story matters so much. The goal is not to reduce a people to percentages. The goal is to see the real shape of their journey. DNA is simply one language we use to listen to the past. It is not the only language, and it is not the final one. So when people ask for the true origins of the Choctaw, the best answer is not a date or pinpoint on a map. It is a process. A long process of local continuity, regional mixing, social adoption, ecological pressure, and political survival. The Choctaw are not a mystery because the data failed. They are a mystery because they were always more than one event could explain. That is what the DNA uncovered. Not a secret tribe hidden somewhere far away. Not a magical unknown source. Something more human and more powerful. A nation built the way most human nations are built. Slowly, relationally, sometimes painfully, always through choices made under pressure. The deeper you look, the less sense it makes to demand a pure beginning. What you find instead is a people shaped by memory, land, and resilience. If history were a song, the Choctaw would not be a single note. They would be the harmony that survives after the first melody is interrupted. You can hear in their story the sound of people staying together when they had every reason to scatter. You can hear towns turning into confederacies, confederacies turning into nations, and nations turning into living memories that refuse to die. That is why this story hits so hard. It forces us to stop treating identity as a frozen picture. Identity is movement with memory. It is a line that keeps being redrawn by the people who carry it. The DNA helps us see the movement. The history helps us understand the memory. And together, they show us a people who were never simple, never static, and never defined by the smallest version of their own story. That is why many modern Choctaw people do not hear these findings as an insult. They hear recognition. They hear confirmation that their grandparents understood something long before any laboratory did. They hear proof that survival often looks messy from the outside. And they hear a warning too. If outsiders keep searching for a pure version of any people, they will miss the truth of how human communities actually live. We are not statues. We are not museum labels. We are not fixed by the first sentence ever written about us. The Choctaw story proves that a nation can be ancient and changing at the same time. It can carry deep roots and still be built from many branches. It can remember where it came from without pretending it came from only one place. And maybe that is the real surprise hidden inside the DNA. Not a contradiction, a revelation. The genome does not say, you were not who you thought you were. It says, you were always more than the narrow story told about you. It says, your ancestors met challenge with adaptability. They did not merely inherit a world. They built one together, again and again. That is why this matters far beyond one nation. In a world obsessed with simple labels, the Choctaw remind us that people are not less beautiful because they are complex. They are often more beautiful because of it. The truth in their blood does not erase the truth in their songs. It deepens it. It tells us that endurance is not the opposite of change. Sometimes endurance is change, held together by memory. Think about a river after a storm. From above, it looks changed. The banks may be wider, the water may be muddier, branches may have been carried downstream, but the river is still the river because motion is part of what it is. Human nations are like that. They are not less themselves because they have carried pieces of other lives into their own current. The Choctaw story teaches that identity is not a sealed container. It is a moving channel. It gathers, it remembers, it keeps going. And when the world tries to divide people into clean categories, the real past quietly refuses. It says, no, that is not how survival worked. Survival worked through contact, through adaptation, through families choosing each other again and again. That is not a weak story. That is the strongest kind. So when you hear the title of this video, do not hear betrayal, hear expansion. The Choctaw were never just a simplistic headline. They were never a single frozen origin point waiting to be discovered. They were a people made through long effort, hard choices, and generations of belonging that had to be renewed again and again. DNA uncovered that their story is older, broader, and more layered than the old version allowed. But that does not take anything away. It gives more depth, more humanity, more respect. And maybe that is the real lesson here. The past is usually bigger than the story we first tell about it. If we are humble enough to listen, science can help us hear that bigger story without replacing the people who lived it. Picture a family table decades from now. A young person asks where they come from. The answer is not a single road, but 1,000 crossings. Some ancestors came from ancient local towns. Some arrived through marriage. Some were taken by conflict and made part of something new. Some survived removal and carried memory into another territory. Some were not Choctaw at birth, but became Choctaw through belonging. And all of that still leads to one living people. That is what makes this story so powerful. The Choctaw are not a footnote in American history. They are proof that identity can survive pressure without becoming small. They are proof that a nation can be made of many threads and still hold together as one cloth. And maybe that is the real surprise hidden inside the DNA. Not a contradiction, a revelation. The genome does not say, you are not who you thought you were. It says, you were always more than the narrow story told about you. It says, your ancestors met challenge with adaptability. They did not merely inherit a world. They built one together again and again. That is why this matters far beyond one nation. In a world obsessed with simple labels, the Choctaw remind us that people are not less beautiful because they are complex. They are often more beautiful because of it. The truth in their blood does not erase the truth in their songs. It deepens it. It tells us that endurance is not the opposite of change. Sometimes endurance is change, held together by memory. When you step back, the story becomes bigger than ancestry. It becomes a lesson about how human beings survive. The Choctaw were not preserved in amber. They were tested. They were moved. They were pushed, pulled, and reshaped by history, yet they remained themselves by choosing each other again and again. That is the part the DNA helps illuminate. Not a hidden replacement story, not a secret that cancels the past. A record of endurance so deep that it became part of the body itself. So the next time someone says identity should be clean, fixed, and easy to trace, remember the Choctaw. Remember that a nation can be built from many beginnings and still speak with one voice. Remember that complexity is not the enemy of truth. It is often the way truth looks when you finally stop simplifying it. The Choctaw were never just one line in a history book. They were a meeting place. They were a crossing point. They were a people who took broken paths, joined them, and kept walking. And the DNA, instead of making that story smaller, shows just how remarkable it really was. That is the real truth uncovered here. Not that the Choctaw were less than we imagined, but that they were more layered, more adaptive, more human. And in the end, that makes their story not less powerful, but unforgettable.